In our text for today, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 to 20, God responds to the fear of his people by promising to speak to them through intermediaries like Moses. And in the process, he initiates the line of prophets who will speak his word to his people and ultimately lead to the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So, grab your copy of the Tanakh and let's get started. The beginning of our reading is a bit difficult since the first two verses really have to be read together to get the full thought that's being communicated. But we're going to take this a bit slowly and read each one separately. Then we'll put the whole thought together after we've read both verse 15 and verse 16. Verse 15 is comprised of three clauses. We'll take the first two clauses together since they create a single thought, though the word order can be a bit perplexing. The verse begins with an object clause followed by the verb, then an indirect object, and finally the subject. The fronting of the object is not by itself so very unusual. What makes this troublesome is the length of the object clause. So let's take this in a word for word fashion to start with. Navi Mekirbekeka, a prophet from your midst, Me Achecha, from your brothers, Kamoni, like me, Yakim Laka, he will raise up for you, Yahweh Eloheka, Yahweh your God. Perhaps the hardest thing here is the sequence Mekirbeka Me'acheka Kamoni. What makes this a bit of a challenge is the awkward repetition in the phrase Mekirbeka Me'acheka. As it stands, I think we have to take this as an appositive, in which the phrase Me'acheka, from your brothers, is intended to clarify the potentially ambiguous Makir Baka. I say potentially ambiguous because the noun kerev is sometimes used for the physical body. So it's possible that this phrase could be misunderstood to suggest that this prophet like Moses will be a biological descendant of Moses. Now, just to be clear, I checked all the examples of this that I could find in the Tanakh. And I don't believe there's a single case in which it is actually used that way with the preposition men. It is used that way in Genesis 25, verse 22, with the preposition base. And in any case, the absence of a parallel example would not necessarily prevent the possibility that it could be taken that way. So the addition of the extra phrase, meachecha, eliminates any possibility of this misunderstanding. God wants to make it clear that he is not setting up some kind of hereditary office of prophet or the idea of a dynasty of chief interpreters of God's will. But the resulting phrase seems to us a little bit clumsy. So it's not surprising that some of the ancient translations, namely the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, attempt to simplify this in translation by reading the equivalent of from the midst of your brothers, shortening the phrase. I'm inclined to think that the Masoretic text reading is the original one, and that the ancient translations are simply smoothing out the reading for simplicity's sake. But I grant you, there's really no real difference in the meaning between the Masoretic text and these early variants. The placement of this appositive phrase, from your midst, from your brothers, is even more of a nuisance, since it separates the next word, kamoni, from the word that it is naturally associated with, navi. The natural thought, a prophet like me, is obscured by the insertion of the appositive phrase between them. It's not a big problem grammatically speaking, but it can make the first part of this verse a little more challenging to sort out. So, putting this together and making it into a little more flowing contemporary English word order, we might read it as something like this: Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from the midst of your brothers. The next clause extends the thought by highlighting what God expects his people to do in response to this gift of his. Elau tishma'un. To him you should listen. The context implies that God is doing this for the guidance of his people, with the expectation that his people would listen to those whom he sends. So for that reason, I would take the verb tishma'un as if it were a subjunctive. Now, in Hebrew usage, we call this a modal imperfect. But I suspect the meaning of that term is a bit obscure to many of you. So let me take a moment to explain this by dealing with different verbal moods. When grammarians speak of verbal moods, they're referring to the fact that many languages, most languages, use different parts or different forms of the verb to communicate different nuances of meaning. These different nuances of meaning are what grammarians call verbal moods. Languages differ in how many moods they employ, but there are some pretty common moods that are shared by most languages. Languages also differ in how they indicate those moods. In English, for example, we tend to distinguish different moods by using auxiliary words rather than by changing the form or the pronunciation of the verb itself. So, for example, in English, we would say, I will go. That would be a statement of fact. We would call that kind of statement of fact the indicative mood. But we could also say, I should go. That would be an expression or expectation or a sense of obligation. And we might call that the subjunctive mood. We could also say, I wish to go. That would be an expression of a desire or wish, or in some cases, an uncertain situation. We might call that the optative mood. And we could even turn it around and say, will I go? That would be the expression of a question. So we would call that the interrogative mood, and so on. By the way, moods are generally understood to be restricted to what grammarians call finite forms of the verb. Non-finite forms are typically not regarded as different moods. Now, I suppose I should add that a finite form of the verb is a form that expresses what we might think of as the full verbal idea. Typically, it has person and number. In Hebrew, the perfect and the imperfect and the volatives are finite forms of the verb. Verb forms that serve non-verbal functions. For example, in biblical Hebrew, the infinitive construct serves as a verbal noun. The infinitive absolute serves as a verbal adverb, and participles serve as verbal adjectives. These parts of verbs that don't perform fully verbal functions are called non-finite verb forms. Indeed, the very name infinitive simply means not finite. But getting back to verbal moods, in biblical Hebrew, Some verbal moods are distinguished by form. So, for example, the indicative, which most people think of as the main form of the verb, and the volatives, the cohortative, imperative, and jussive. And those three together kind of subsume what we might sometimes think of as the optative mood in other languages. These all have distinct forms, but other moods are not distinguished by form in Biblical Hebrew. So in Biblical Hebrew, there is no difference in form between the indicative, I will go, and the subjunctive, I should go, for example. Now, to be clear, the meaning or the function of these moods still exist. They're just not distinguished in terms of verbal form. So when we encounter a verb form that looks from the context like it's performing the function of, say, the subjunctive, but which is the same morphological form as the indicative, we recognize that functional distinction by calling the form a modal indicative. By that, we mean that the form is the same as the indicative, but that we should take it as some other mood, in this case, the subjunctive mood. Well, getting back to verse 15 now. The full thought that God is expressing through Moses is not finished at the end of this verse, but continues on in verse 16. So let's look at verse 16 and then we'll put the two together. The verse break between verses 15 and 16 is unfortunate, since it obscures the close connection between what is said in them. Verse 16 is a direct continuation of the thought of verse 15. K'kol asher sha'alta me'im Yahweh Elohecha b'chorev, bayom hakahal lemor. In accordance with everything that you ask from Yahweh your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly. The preposition kaf at the beginning of the phrase makes the point that God is going to give them this prophet in response to what the people themselves have asked for. Remember, kaf is generally used to introduce a comparison or correspondence. In this case, the comparison or correspondence is between what the people asked for and what Yahweh is going to do. So what Yahweh will do corresponds to what the people requested. The rest of the clause consists of two prepositional phrases. Both begin with the preposition beth. The first indicating the place of the request, on or at Mount Horeb. The second indicating the time of the request, on the day of the assembly. As you know, one of the most important functions of the preposition beth is to indicate location. And that can be location in space, it can be location in time, or it can be location in what we might think of as a social context. Here we have both location in space and location in time represented in these two examples in this same phrase. The occasion being referred to here is, of course, the appearance of God at the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, also called Mount Horeb. There we read in Exodus 20, verses 18 and 19. Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and terrified. And they stood far off and said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die." As verse 16 continues, Moses quotes what they said on that previous occasion. Lo osef lishmoa el kol Yahweh Elohai. I don't want to hear again the voice of Yahweh my God. The combination osef lishmoah at the beginning of the statement is an example of what we call verbal hendiadys. Verbal hendiadys is the use of two verbs to communicate a single thought. Here, the first verb is a hiphil imperfect, first common singular, from the first wow verb, yasaf, to add or to increase. When used in verbal hendiadys, it becomes what we would think of in English as a helping verb, expressing the idea of continuation or repetition. So we usually render it with the sense of something like doing something over again, or perhaps continuing to do something. Now, in this case, the thing that they don't want to do anymore is reflected in the second verb, the infinitive construct of shama, to hear or listen to. And what they don't want to hear is the voice of God. Now, there is a technical issue with the pointing of osef here that I just want to mention so you'll be aware of it. If we could just go back to that form. The regular form of the hiphil first person singular imperfect indicative is pointed with a hirik or hirik yod rather than with a tsere. The pointing with a tsere, preserved in Codex Leningrad, is characteristic of the old shortened imperfect, which is preserved in biblical Hebrew in the jussive and the wow consecutive imperfect forms. This suggests that the scribe who copied Codex Leningrad, by the way, his name was Samuel ben Jacob, that he would have read this as a rare first-person jussive. Now, I'm pretty sure that when you first learned Hebrew, you learned that in Hebrew, jussives are the third-person volatives, imperatives are the second-person volatives, and the cohortative is the first-person volative. And that's mostly true. But there are a few rare instances of first-person jussives in biblical Hebrew. And it appears that Samuel ben Jacob, the scribe who copied Codex Leningrad, understood this word as one of these rare first-person jussives. And so he pointed it accordingly. When I looked at this, I decided that I would read it as an indicative rather than as a jussive. And there were two reasons for my choice. First, the textual apparatus indicates that there is evidence from other manuscripts that this was read as an indicative. And second, the verb that corresponds to this verb in the second part of the sentence, I will see, is clearly indicative and not adjussive. So it made sense to me to read both of these verbs the same way. And since the first is ambiguous and the second is clearly indicative, I choose to read them both as indicatives. Now, if you prefer to follow Samuel ben Jacob and read this as a rare first-person jussive, and that is the way that it's actually pointed, then you would render it something like this. You might say, "Let me not hear again the voice of Yahweh my God." There's also a potential problem with how one understands the sense of this statement. And this is related to the fact that the Hebrew verb shama, to hear or listen to, can also have the sense of to obey. So it's quite possible to understand these same words in Hebrew to be saying, I will no longer obey the voice of Yahweh my God. Now that really is a very different meaning, but it is an equally defensible meaning based on the vocabulary and the grammar. So how can we tell whether the Israelites are refusing to obey God or whether they're saying that they were so overwhelmingly terrified that they can't bear to hear the voice of God speaking to them. The question can't be answered on the basis of the words of the sentence alone. Understanding the words and understanding them correctly requires attending to the context. In both Exodus 20 and here in Deuteronomy 18, the context makes it clear that the people are so traumatized by the thunderous sound and the shaking of the earth and the smoke rolling up from the mountaintop and the flashing lightning. They are so terrified at the manifestation of the presence of God that they can't bear the thought of experiencing that again. So they ask for an intermediary to speak with God and then to tell them what God says. So the potential problem in meaning that I referred to a moment ago is resolved for us by a proper understanding of the context. And that's why one always has to take context into account when reading. The rest of the quotation continues the description of this terrifying event. ואת האיש הגדולה הזאת לא אראה עוד. And this great fire I do not want to see again. The phrase האש הגדולה הזאת is a classic example of an attributive adjectival phrase in Hebrew. In an attributive adjective phrase, the modifying words, in this case, gadol, great, and zoth, this, follow the noun that they modify and agree with it in gender, in number, and in definiteness. Remember, this is different from how a predicate adjective phrase is constructed. Now, if you don't recall the difference between attributive adjective phrases and predicate adjective phrases, this would be a good opportunity to go back and review that point. The last phrase finished the thought by stating why they don't want to hear God's voice or see the theophanic fire of God's presence. Velo amuth, so that I do not die. Here, the conjunction wow introduces a purpose clause, the purpose obviously being to avoid dying. So now that we've looked at verses 15 and 16 slowly, section by section, let's put them together and get the complete thought that's being communicated here. So if we put them together, we would read something like, Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. You should listen to him, since that is what you asked for from Yahweh your God at Mount Sinai on the day of the assembly, when you said, I don't want to hear the voice of Yahweh my God anymore. And I don't want to see this great fire again, so that I will not die. In verse 17, we get the beginning of what God says in response to the people's request for an intermediary. Vayomer Yahweh Elai, Hetibu asher diberu. Then Yahweh said to me, what they speak is right. The opening statement of God's response can be a little bit difficult to sort out. There are two basic ways that we can take the syntax of this phrase, Hetibu asher diberu. The verb is a hiphil of the root yathav. In the hiphil, this verb typically has the sense of to be well, in the sense of to prosper, or to do well, in the sense of either being competent or in the sense of acting in an ethically proper manner, or the sense of to be right in the idea of being correct. The question here is really, what is the subject of the verb? Now, one way to handle this would be to take the subject of the verb hetivu to be the people, unexpressed but understood from the context. And if we take it that way, we would read this: they, meaning the people, did well. The question then becomes, what do you make of the phrase asher deberu? One answer could be that we take the asher to be introducing a substantive clause. Remember, a substantive clause is a group of words that, when taken together, function the way that a noun functions. In this case, the substantive clause would be taken as what grammarians would call an accusative of specification. Well, what does that mean? In grammar speak, an accusative of specification is a word or group of words that indicates the particular sphere or the context to which a verb applies. If we take it that way, we would understand God's words to mean something like, they did well with respect to what they said. And that's the way that the Jewish Publication Society's translation, the Tanakh, takes this when it reads, they have done well in speaking thus. So that's one possibility. The second way of handling this is to take the phrase asher diberu as a relative clause without an antecedent. Remember, a relative clause is a group of words that gives additional information about something mentioned elsewhere in the sentence. That something mentioned elsewhere in the sentence is what we call the antecedent. Well, sometimes there are formations that look like relative clauses, but they don't actually have an antecedent. We sometimes call them headless relative clauses. Headless relative clauses can function like nouns as subjects or objects of a verb. Here's an example in English. We might say, what we do not understand, we fear. In this sentence, the clause, what we do not understand, looks like a relative clause, but it doesn't actually have an antecedent. In this case, the clause would function as the object of the verb fear. But getting back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 17, if we take asher deberu as a headless relative clause, then we would have to take it as the subject of the verb he tivu, and we'd render the sentence something like this: what they say is right. And that's basically how the Net Bible and the NIV take it. So we have two possibilities for how to handle this: as a headless relative clause, functioning as the subject of the verb, or as an accusative of specification, with the understood subject as the people. Now, either would be grammatically possible and acceptable. But I'm going with the first one, the headless relative clause, simply because it seems to capture the essence of what God is saying and does that in a way that seems to me to be the most understandable way to express this in modern English. How God intends to provide his people with these intermediaries becomes clear in verse 18. The first half of this verse largely echoes the language of verse 15. The main difference is that in verse 15, Moses was speaking to the people. Here, God is speaking to Moses when he says, Navi Akim lahim mikerev me'acheka kamoka. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. The second half of this verse adds more detail to what Moses told the Israelites in verse 15. Wanathati divarai bepu wadaber alehem ethkol asher atzawinu. So I will put my words in his mouth, so that he can speak to them everything that I have commanded him. Now, most of this is straightforward and requires little comment. Note that I did take the form wadiber as another modal form and read it as so that he can speak, rather than as a simple indicative, he will speak. Otherwise, we might want to observe that the verb form utsawinu is a PL imperfect from the third hay verb tsawa, with a third person singular object suffix. But since all 494 instances of this verb tsawa occur in the PL, the parsing doesn't really give us any additional information that's useful for reading. So let's go on to verse 19. Now, God has made it clear that he will provide prophets as intermediaries to speak his word on his behalf. Next, he explains what will happen to those who ignore his prophets. V'haya ha'ish asher lo yishma el davarai asher yedaver b'shemi. So it will happen that the man who does not obey my words that he will speak in my name. The form wahaya that begins the sentence is followed by ha'ish. This introduces a hypothetical circumstance, but one that is virtually certain to come about in the future. God expects that his people will hear and obey what his prophet proclaims. Now, that's all pretty straightforward and clear. But what will happen if someone does not obey? That's the subject of the next clause. Anoki edrosh me'imo. I myself will seek it from him. Now, there's nothing difficult about the grammar or the syntax here. We have the compound preposition me'im, a combination of men, from, and im, with, that indicates the source or the origin, or in some cases the agent of an action. So there's no real difficulty there. The lack of clarity, such as it is, arises from the use of the word darash. This word commonly refers to searching for something, or hunting or seeking something. It's often used in the sense of to investigate, and as in to try to find out something. Now, when it's used with God as the object, this word can be a worship term, as in seek the Lord. Often it's used for inquiring of God in prayer, to seek an answer from God, or to seek to know God's will. But sometimes, when God is the subject, this verb takes on a sense of holding someone accountable for something. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 23, Moses warns Moses not to delay in fulfilling their vows. He says, if you swear a vow to Yahweh your God, do not hesitate to fulfill it. For Yahweh your God will certainly seek it from you, and it will be counted as a sin against you. Now, in that verse, when Moses says that God will seek it from them, he means that God will require it of them. In our text, God seeks obedience, to what he says through his prophet. He expects it. He demands it. And if he does not get it, he will regard it as a sin on the part of those who disobey. So the message is clear. You asked for an intermediary. I'm going to provide them and my prophets, so you had better listen to them. But if the appointment of prophets as God's messengers creates an obligation on behalf of the people to listen to them, it also creates an obligation on behalf of those who claim to speak in God's name. And that's the subject of the last verse in our text for today. In verse 20, God speaks about two kinds of prophets who will incur his wrath. Those who presume to speak on God's behalf, and those who speak on behalf of other gods. If we look at the way this verse is put together, we'll see that it begins with the subject, the prophet. This is followed by three relative clauses, each introduced by a share, and then one final clause that indicates what will happen to any of the prophets who fall within the categories that are defined by the relative clauses. So let's take this clause by clause to make it easier to digest. Ak hanavi. Now, the only difficulty here is how to take this particle ak. This word is normally used in one of three ways in biblical Hebrew. First, it's most often used as an emphatic adverb. So we would translate it something like surely, or certainly, or indeed. Second, it's sometimes used as a restrictive adverb. A restrictive adverb is one that introduces an exception to what is being said, or restricts the action to a particular person or circumstance. In that case, we would typically translate it as something like except or only. And in the third case, it's sometimes used as an adversative adverb, that is to introduce an alternate case. In that case, we would translate it something like however or but. There is, of course, no way to know ahead of time which one of these uses is being employed. You just have to try each one of them out and see which one fits the context best. I did that, and it appears to me that the best fit here is the adversative use, because the clause that follows is introducing or referring to a different category than the one that was preceding it. So I would read this as, but as for the prophet, the question of which prophet is being spoken of will be answered by the relative clauses that follow. Asher Yazid Daber Davar Bishmi, who presumes to speak a word in my name. Now, the first of these relative clauses is very straightforward. The only challenge is the little used verb zid, which is a stative, hollow verb that means to be arrogant or be presumptuous. That is, to claim a status or a gift that is not really given to him. Presumption is a fault that is regularly condemned in the Tanakh, particularly when it involves someone who assumes a role that is not properly theirs because it wasn't given to them by God. As, for example, when Saul takes it upon himself to offer a sacrifice instead of waiting for Samuel in 1 Samuel 13. He's guilty of the sin of presumption. In the same way, God says that he will hold accountable those who call themselves prophets, who presume to speak in his name. The next Asher clause finishes the description of this group of prophets. Ethasher lo tsiwithi ledaber, whom I did not command to speak. So the first category is those who claim to be prophets but have no command from God to speak on his behalf. In this clause, the relative particle asher has the definite direct object marker on it, since it functions as the object of the verb tsawa, command, that's inside the relative clause itself. There's nothing particularly difficult or grammatically unusual about that. The next relative clause, introduced also with a wow, introduces the second type of prophet that God condemns. Wa'asher yedaber b'shem Elohim acherim, or who speaks in a name of any other God. Again, there's no particular difficulty here. I have chosen to take the phrase Elohim acherim as a singular, any other God, rather than as a plural, other gods, partially because the word name is both singular and indefinite, and partially because I understand the sentence to be condemning any and all appeal to the authority of any other God besides Yahweh. And the singular seems to me to make that point more emphatically in English than the plural. But you could take it as the plural if you wished. The last phrase concludes the verse by telling us what will happen to those who do these things. Umeth hanavi hahu, then that prophet will die. The verb form meth could be either a call perfect, third masculine singular, or a call participle, masculine singular, of the hollow verb muth. I'm reading it here as the participle because the context suggests to me that a future tense is appropriate, and that fits more easily with a participle than with a perfect. If I were going to read it as a perfect, then I would probably take it in the sense of a durative perfect and render it something like, that prophet dies. Before we leave our look at our text from Deuteronomy 18, we might pause for a moment and think about how one might preach the gospel from this text. Now, the central message of this passage is quite clear. Israel was terrified by its encounter with the presence of God at Mount Horeb. The people begged God not to appear to them in that way again, but to use an intermediary to give them his teaching. God had already chosen Moses for that function, but here in our text, God promises that in accordance with the people's request, he will continue to send others, his prophets, to speak his word to his people as intermediaries. In that sense, this text marks the beginning of the prophetic movement in Israel. But God's sending prophets also creates an obligation on the part of the people to listen to those whom God will send. And God also warns any others who might pretend to be his prophets or who would dare to speak in the name of any other God that they would die if they did so. On the surface, there's not really any obvious gospel message in this text. There's no promise of salvation. There's not even a statement of the relationship between God and his people. But it seems to me that there are at least two relatively straightforward avenues to work legitimately from this text to preaching the gospel. The first would be to pursue the redemptive history path and to show how God fulfilled this promise through the various prophets that he sent throughout the generations. This path leads to Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of this promise. This is the way that Peter uses this text in his speech of Acts 3:23 and following, and the way that Stephen interprets it in his speech in Acts 7, verse 37 and following. It highlights the way that the various prophets sent by God throughout the ages not only prophesied the coming of Christ, they also foreshadowed him, in the sense that while they interpreted and communicated God's plan to his people, Jesus fulfilled that plan. So he was greater than the prophets who came before him. The prophets proclaimed God's redemptive work. Jesus is God's redemptive work. So these words of promise about the prophets who were to come are very much a messianic prophecy, pointing to Jesus as the supreme prophet and more than a prophet. Now, this is the most obvious and easy choice as a way to preach the text. It's simple to write, simple to preach, and simple for the audience to understand. But its simplicity is also, in a sense, its weakness. It's conventional and predictable. Chances are that many people in your audience will have heard this message or one very similar to it many times before. They may be able to anticipate what you're going to say before you get there. Now, that doesn't make it a bad choice, but it is something to consider. I think there's a less obvious and less conventional path to the gospel here as well. The second path would begin with the idea of the fear of the people. It might point out that their fear highlights the alienation from God that is the universal human experience after the fall. Adam and Eve responded to that alienation by trying to hide from God. The Israelites at Mount Sinai responded to that alienation by begging God not to appear to them in that way again. Many people in our day respond to that alienation by closing their eyes and hoping that God will just go away. They seem to think that if they deny him long enough, he will just cease to exist. The truly wondrous thing in this text is how God responds to their fear at being alienated from God. His willingness not only to give them his teaching and make them his people, but to do it in a way that understands their fear. This reveals his compassion for them. It reaches out to them in a way that they can hear and receive him. And in that, it demonstrates his love for them, even when they are alienated from him and in the midst of the terror of his power and righteous judgment. And it's this desire on God's part to restore his relationship with us that led God to become man in Jesus Christ, to live, to suffer, to die, and to be raised from the dead, so that they no longer have to fear God. Because through Jesus, they can once again approach God as a loving Father who created them and welcomes them into his loving presence now and forever. And that speaks a double message to us. First, that God treats us like he treated the Israelites. He shows us compassion and love by incorporating us into his people. And the second message that the text has for us is a powerful reminder that we don't help people into the kingdom of God by preaching fear and judgment. that tends to drive people away from God. We help people into the kingdom of God by loving them into his kingdom. Well, there are certainly other paths from this text to the gospel as well. But these are two paths that have the virtue of being well rooted in aspects of the text. And one of them is focused on the fulfillment of the promise, the other is focused on God's motivation in giving the promise. But they both allow us to preach the gospel from a text like this, where there's no obvious gospel present. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me as we've read Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 to 20. And I hope you'll join me again soon for another opportunity to read and study the Word of God together in the language in which He inspired it to be written. Until then, shalom in Jesus.